Hi, everybody. I'm Kathleen Merrigan. I'm a professor of sustainable food systems at Arizona State University, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator for today's event. I know you're going to find this extremely informative. So this is my face mask. Farmers are essential. I wear it everywhere. It's a good opening thought for the day. We've been through an extremely tough year, and there's no end in sight. I was reading an old document from the World Health Organization for a paper I'm writing, and it was talking about how countries invest heavily in protecting themselves from terrorist attacks, but not the attack of a virus, which could be far more deadly and far more damaging economically and socially. And it said, prediction, a pandemic could bring economies to their knees. Well, you betcha, here we are. And I'm feeling it very much in Arizona. I'm just down the road from Navajo Nation, where we see the highest incidence of COVID per capita in the country, in large part because 15,000 Navajo homes still have no access to running water or electricity. The job, ladies and gentlemen, of rural electrification continues. So that's sort of where we are. We meet today with a very different view of the world, a very different view of our nation and of our own vulnerabilities. And then we meet today on the cusp of new things, politically. Perhaps we're on the cusp of a changeover in the White House. As a Democrat, I have to quickly say jinx. But even if our president is reelected, oftentimes there's a transition of sorts across the executive branch. There are key races in Congress that are about to be decided that could shake up leadership with combining that with various retirements. We have a changed Supreme Court, and perhaps even more justice is on the way. So it feels like a time that we really need to, as Joan Rivers used to say, talk. That brings us to today's panel. 4 incredible experts known for high quality, rigorous research. I hope they can help us look into that crystal ball and imagine what life looks like on the other side of COVID, post-election, and gearing up for the next Farm Bill. We'll hear about trade for sure. And with the latest brush up on the WTO leadership, the plot thickens. While we've lost markets and maybe those lost markets have been compensated in the short term with globs of money coming out of the CCC. Globs is a technical term. You economists understand that. Globs of money pouring out of the CCC. I mean, we've got to face some facts. Some of those markets may never be recovered. And we've had 3 years of extraordinary payments. The CCC has been always the secret weapon of USDA. I know in my time at USDA, my fellow deputies across the federal space were very jealous of the CCC authority, as well they should have been. Have we opened up the CCC to greater scrutiny and put it at peril? We'll hear today about food insecurity. At the same time those payments have been going out to producers, we see efforts to cut back on SNAP. Will that holy alliance that actually brings about a farm bill, that coming together of nutrition and farm advocates working together to get that omnibus legislation passed, will that be there in the future? We may hear about regulations. The Trump administration kicked off of what was known as the 2-for-1 executive order and a very strong anti-regulatory stance. For every new regulation put out, 2 would have to be repealed. On the other side of all these transitions to come, will we still be in that space? American agriculture is threatened by lack of immigration reform, climate change, and the countryside is demanding redress on concentration and consolidation. Could there be surprises in the next Farm Bill? Well, we have just the group of experts to tell us all. Let me begin by introducing our first panelist and inviting him to what has become known as the Zoom stage. Our first panelist is Barry Goodwin, who is at AEI right now and NC State. He is the William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor and Graduate Alumni Distinguished Professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Economics. Now, I give the full name of those professorships because I have a named one too, and that's very important to the people who helped provide those named professorships. Barry is also a 2018 Holiday Medal recipient. He's held faculty positions in the past at Kansas State and Ohio State, and his research and teaching activities are focused on applied economics, policy, trade, and econometrics. Barry, thank you so much. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Can everyone see that? Well, Vince asked me to talk about safety nets within the context of the Farm Bill. And anytime we talk about nets, we, in terms of ag policy, we also think about trampolines. So we were just discussing that earlier. It's a paper from 25 years ago, probably, that we made that connection. But I'm going to start out just very briefly. I think Dan is going to circle back to this and talk about sort of the income situation. But if you're listening to what's happening in the, what's being reported in the mainstream press and everything, you will hear about the fact that farm incomes are down. And that is true. They are down relative to what they were earlier in the decade. But if you look at longer run averages, we're on target or about average, or actually even a little better than average. So, interpret that as you will, but there's not a lot of evidence that things have changed all that much. But here's sort of the important fly in the ointment that I find very, very fascinating. But for a long time, we had, Title I payments, which grew into ARC and PLC, and I'll talk about the operation of those in a minute. Fixed direct payments went away in 2014, as we know, but you look at what's happened recently, market facilitation payments, and then these other payments, which are the CFAP payments, the COVID-related payments, which are extraordinary. I think the estimates, I'm not sure we know exactly what they're going to be, but 30, I've seen all sorts of estimates, 30 or 40 billion. And of course, that has a lot to do with the current election year politics and everything. But, whether this is an effort to secure the farm vote or to provide relief where it's needed, I think we'll be debating for a while. But it is interesting that, to my understanding at least, the administration sort of did an end run around Congress. We've heard a lot of noise about the failure of Congress to reach an agreement on COVID aid in general, but this was done through the CCC, which I think is quite interesting. So again, if you look at similar picture here, but what I want to focus on is what's happened in 2019 and 2020. Government payments now comprise 40% of net farm income. So it would be that much lower. The gray line here is what we would have in terms of net farm income without CFAP, which is the COVID payments. A major difference there. So we've seen some pretty extraordinary payments being made to the farm sector here. So I'm going to talk about the 2018 Farm Bill, which is what we're in right now. And Vince asked me to talk about safety nets. And I think that really means Title I programs, commodities, and crop insurance. There are some safety net programs elsewhere in the miscellaneous and so forth, some minor programs, but this is the percentages here are how the budget is allocated. And of course, nutrition, the SNAP program, which Diane's going to talk about, it accounts for the biggest share of things, 76% as CBO scored it. The Title I programs, 7%. That is PLC and ARC. And again, I'll talk about what that means here in just a second. Conservation's been pretty steady at 6 to 7% for the past several years. We have seen an increasing role for crop insurance, both as a subsidy vehicle and as a safety net program, if you even want to try to separate those two things. But crop insurance now is 8.9% of the budget. And insurance was brought into the Farm Bill as Title 11 in 2008. So it does not rely on the Farm Bill for its authorizing legislation. That comes through the 1980 Federal Crop Insurance Act, but it was brought in as a Farm Bill program. So really, there were only modest changes as we went from 2014 to 2018. The last time, Vince, you'll remember that we talked about this. I think it was at IFPRI. One of the favorite things to talk about was the fact that now you could have cousins, nieces, and nephews eligible for the full limit of payments. Some minor changes to the safety net program as it operates through crop insurance. There's been a big push from the environmental side to allow cover crops to be classified as good farming practice and for growers not to be penalized for that. I think the jury's still out. I've actually done some work in this area and looked at it, and whether adopting cover crops increases risk or decreases it is still a matter of debate among the agronomists. Enterprise units are now allowed across counties. We have some other minor things. In North Carolina, and I'm sure in a lot of other states, hemp has been a big issue. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether this is just a bubble or not, because we have awful lot of hemp being grown on old tobacco land here in North Carolina. We did see an increase in loan rates and some changes to the dairy program. So there are, as I see it, sort of three avenues for safety nets to operate, three mechanisms there. The first is ad hoc, which means, outside of the Farm Bill, for the purposes at hand, I believe. MFP is a good example of that, the market facilitation payments, which have been made in response to perceived losses associated with the trade war with China, the tariff battle. We have the CFAP phases 1 and 2, which I just talked about, very big. If you go back into the 1990s, we had something called market loss assistance. And it's an interesting story that we don't have time to get into, but coming out of the FAIR Act, that the Agricultural Market Transition Act, which did not result in a transition to the market. But as we came out of that, everybody felt good about reducing the government involvement in agriculture. But a couple of years later, when prices turned down, Congress jumped in big time with market loss assistance, which actually became in 2002 a Title I program. Once you put those benefits out there, as we see, it's hard to pull them back in, and I really wonder about this extraordinary ad hoc payments, CFAP and MFP and so forth, what the future of that is going to be. But market loss assistance became counter-cyclical payments, a program that was part of the Farm Bill Title I. And today that has sort of evolved into price loss coverage, PLC. We have as an alternative to that, and producers have to choose something called agricultural risk coverage, ARC. And Vince and I, and Bruce Babcock, actually, we looked at ACRE several years ago and the operation of that. I think ARC is sort of the evolution of the ACRE program, which went away and I think became ARC. What's important to keep in mind about those two programs is they are paid on base acreage and base yields. And there's some subtle differences in terms of how base could be updated. The Congress has allowed this base acreage, which initially was established in the 80s, to be updated periodically with some of the farm bills. And there's some minor differences here. But we also have marketing loans, which are directly coupled to production. Now, as I'm going to show you, the loan rates were increased in the 2018 Farm Bill. These are, the loan rates really represent a price floor. And for most crops, they remain largely, I won't say irrelevant because growers know there's a floor there, but they're not triggering payments right now. And that's paid on actual production through loan deficiency payments or gains through marketing loans. Then we have what I said is increasing in prominence, subsidized crop insurance. It's been around for a long, long time, first introduced in 38. We have this 1980 Federal Crop Insurance Act that I mentioned earlier, but it's a Farm Bill title now, Title 11. Okay, there's too much here to talk about in the big picture, but I want to call your attention to the final column over here. Those are the PLC payment rates that we saw in 2019. And you will see for almost all crops, oats, I'll put that off on the side, but for almost all crops, there were positive PLC payments made. The PLC payments are really the difference between the reference price, which is the guaranteed price. It's guaranteed on base, however, and the marketing year average price, which you see there. But interesting enough, the one commodity that appears not to have triggered PLC payments is soybeans. And oddly enough, if you look at how base acreage was allocated relative to the 2014 Act, now in 2014, you had to decide ARC or PLC, and you were stuck with it for the entire time. Producers still face that decision. I believe they're not as constrained in terms of year to year, but in 2014, corn and soybeans went entirely to ARC. And there's a couple of options for that, but really one of them is irrelevant. So we're talking about agricultural risk coverage at the county level. You'll see really how the breakdown is here. Grain sorghum was split. 100% of peanuts, 100% of rice went with PLC because of some very generous reference prices for those commodities. But corn and soybeans stayed at or were at mainly acreage being allocated to the agricultural risk coverage. That flipped quite a bit. Things changed. You can look here and see what the third column over there tells us what the percentage of base was that was enrolled in PLC. And for every commodity except for soybeans, you saw a big shift from, well, some of them didn't shift, some of them were there already, but you see things really stuck in price loss coverage. Again, we're talking about commodities, commodity programs and crop insurance, and conservation is relevant, but it's a small relative to the big picture that Diane's going to talk about, which is nutrition programs. It's interesting. I don't have a lot of time and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but if you study this long enough, you'll see the movement in SNAP payments, SNAP program benefits there, which really track the general economy. But what I find really interesting is the increased prominence, the increased role for crop insurance as a safety net program. And then the red bars here are Title I commodity programs, which have gone down over time. And then conservation is staying relatively steady, and it's sort of under the radars in terms of the three major programs there. Okay, but what's startling about this is the increased prominence of crop insurance as a vehicle to provide a safety net. Okay, I can sum this up in one sentence. Almost all growers participate in the federal crop insurance program, and that has been achieved through some very, very generous subsidies. The average subsidy now is about 65%. That means that for every dollar expected to be paid out in indemnities, the government or the taxpayer, you and I, pay 65 cents of that. The farmer only pays 35 cents, which means for each 35 cents they put in, they expect to get $1 back. So it's a pretty good deal. And it's no surprise that farmers have gone heavily into crop insurance. There's $110 billion in liability. I'll just give you a few figures. The numbers are big, they're startling. 1.1 million policies, 379 million acres. Total premium is 10 billion, but of that, 6.4 billion is paid by the taxpayer. Okay, so it is a massive program by any measure. And the cost here are really split up between premium subsidies and what's called the administrative and operating reimbursement, which serves to be I wouldn't say a guarantee, but it's intended to pay the operating cost for the companies that service this program. And then they get to keep a good chunk of the underwriting gains or losses as well. So it's a fascinating creation, the standard reinsurance agreement. I challenge everybody, if you're having trouble going to sleep at night, pick this up. It's online. It's about, I don't know, 500 pages, and you can weed through exactly what the companies have to do. But the bottom line is it guarantees them, for the most part, it allows them to shift risk to the taxpayer. They can pick and choose which policies they want to hold, and they're guaranteed a share of premium in the A&O reimbursement, and they also get to keep a big share of the gains, and they don't have to pay as much of the losses when things don't go as well. I'll jump over this. It's really just points out that the 65% is spread across different coverage levels, and how you choose to insure your different fields, whether you should insure them all together or individually, has a big effect on what your premium subsidy is, and therefore the premium that a farmer has to pay. I won't go through the bottom part of this. The CBO did a study, which I think is fascinating, and I encourage everyone to look at it. But there were a lot of discussions in the Farm Bill deliberations about cutting back on crop insurance, cutting the cost, cutting the subsidies. And those cuts would have come through a reduction in subsidies or capping subsidies at a certain level for larger farms, through means testing, incomes testing. And then a big one is to eliminate what's called the harvest price option, which allows growers to take indemnities at the higher of planting or harvest time prices. And if you look there, you'll see that changing eliminating the harvest price option would have had a very big impact on the cost of the program. In the end of the day, what happened with crop insurance is what's interesting about it is really what didn't happen. All of these reforms that were discussed were shut down. Okay, that's I don't know how I'm doing on time, but
you're kind of out of time, Barry, but you've seeded a lot of questions for our Q&A.
Happy to hit them. So we're going to do this at the end, right?
Yeah. Do you have any last final thought? I didn't mean to cut you off because it's so great and so rich.
To the end. So this is a perfect stopping point. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Barry. That's a great presentation. I have all kinds of questions. I know people out in the audience do. And what you don't know is that Barry has been in and out technologically because of the storms where he is. So I'm really pleased that he was able to get through his presentation, and hopefully we'll be there for Q&A. All right. Well, next up on our panel is Daniel Sumner. So Dan is the Frank H. Buck Jr. Distinguished Professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Davis and Director of the University of California Agricultural Issues Center. In previous lives, Daniel was a professor at NC State, and he served as the President's Council of Economic Advisors and as Assistant Secretary for Economics at USDA. Dan, the Zoom room is yours.
Good. And let me know if you can see my screen. If that's working, I'm going to proceed. And I'll try to, Kathleen, get us a little closer back on time because Diane does have, I think, $75 billion worth of government payments to talk about. I recognize the topic here is the future, but of course we're going to talk about the past to get to the future. And I'm going to hit my main points in case I do run out of time. You will have heard the standard Farm Bill style subsidies these days, risk management, counter-cyclical payments that Barry went through. They're designed to automatically ramp up government subsidy when the markets generate less revenue. Barry didn't stress the fact, but most of what's called crop insurance is revenue insurance. It's not just for yields, it's revenue. And so if the markets generate less revenue, these programs are designed to pay farmers a lot more. Well, what happens? What happened when the White House shocked the markets system in 2018 with some disruptions related to trade? One might think, well, we have countercyclical payments in place. We'll use them. We didn't. We turned those off. They became trivial, and we did something ad hoc program called the Market Facilitation Program. You might have called it the Market Replacement Program because it said, forget markets. We'll do this with payments instead. Whether you like the program or not, that's essentially what it did. And the idea there, and I've come to think of this almost like a takings case, where there's lots of debate in the Supreme Court exactly when you compensate, when the government has to compensate somebody for building a road or wanting to take some other government action. But in this case, the White House basically said, we screwed up your market. We'll make sure you get the money anyway. So we took away from you a market access, so we will give it back to you with the taxpayers' money. And that was done outside the programs that were designed to do that automatically. And that's the point. If it was simply a matter of prices falling, that should have come back through crop insurance, revenue insurance, or come back through the ARC or the PLC. But we didn't rely on those, in part because the laws that Congress passed didn't seem like they were spending enough money. Then in 2020, we had the same thing. Much of the losses in agriculture weren't due to the pandemic. They were due to the government response to the pandemic. And again, I'm going to leave aside, I'm not an epidemiologist, were those good policies or bad policies. We can leave those aside. But the federal government said, we screwed up the economy. In agriculture, in this case, we're going to give you a bunch of money. The difference was, in this case, agriculture was sort of going along with everyone else. So we're talking about government payments with T's in front. That's trillion, not billion. And agriculture was a part of that. The farm bill programs and crop insurance were ignored, essentially irrelevant. What we used to think, Barry, was a lot of money, your 8 or 10 billion, chump change. It doesn't. It's got the wrong letter in front of it. You're talking billions. We're talking trillions. Two rationales: the government created the problem, so it needed to pay compensation, and commodities not in the farm bill were also hit, so they got some of the money. It wasn't just corn and soybeans, rice and cotton, the list that Barry had, but it was almonds and walnuts and sesame seeds. I'm going to talk about milk for a minute because just as an example, so I could have done this chart with lots of other commodities. We have a program called the Milk Margin Program, or where we compensate milk if the margin between the milk price and the feed cost gets low. Well, I've got an orange line that's 2019. That margin was considered low. It was below $9 for half of 2019, and farmers got a lot of money from this program. I'll show you the number in a minute. Prices, that margin was high, partly because milk prices were relatively high towards the end of 2019. That's showed as December here. January, they were a little lower, these margins. Milk prices were a little lower. Going through March, prices were still sort of okay. We just dipped into the danger zone with a margin below 950, then collapse. 2 months worth of collapse, but by June we were back up high again. We've been high since then. September and October actually been pretty good too. But during this period, you'd say, okay, we have a program for that. That isn't what happened. Under this payment program, there's some details here. It's an essentially free program for something like 200 good cows on a farm, very low premiums. That's the $9.50 margin for the first 5 million pounds of milk. And those kick in a lot. In 2018, 84% of farmers enrolled. In 2019, if you remember, prices looked high. And in 2020, prices looked high. But in late 2019, prices looked quite good, and only 52% of farmers enrolled in this program. And it looks like we're going to spend $0.2 billion on it. So that's not trillions. That's not very much money. That's like 0.5 of 1% of milk revenue. Quite small. So did this program kick in? Yeah, it did exactly what it was designed to do. Was it enough money? Evidently not. Not enough for Congress and the political demands anyway. Here's what the futures markets. So what I've shown you, the first half of this chart tells you the history, and you see this spike in this collapse in milk prices in April and May, then a zoom up, but only in cheese prices. Cheese in the class 3, which is a cheese milk. The butter and milk powder and non-fat dry milk and the butter index, all of those travel together. They stayed low. What's happening into the future? So now we're sitting here in October, at the end of October. The futures markets are telling us we're going to have a gradual decline in the in the cheese and the class 3 price, and into 2021 we'll be back to normal milk prices at roughly where we were back in January of 2020, which was considered a pretty good time for milk prices. What's going to happen to our guaranteed program? Our compensation program will still be there. What about ad hoc payments? We don't know. I want to show you a pie, a couple of pies here. In 2017, these are berries programs, we can call them. $12.1 billion, mostly in price loss coverage and agricultural risk coverage. I put those together, the old farm bill programs. Conservation, there's a few more billion there. And a little bit of a, there's always some disaster in agriculture, and here was a little bit of disaster money. In 2018, that's the first time we came in and said, sorry, we, meaning the government screwed up your market, so the government will pay you. And that's the market facilitation program. The total payments only went up to 12.4 billion. So what that says is that the farm bill programs actually shrunk quite a bit in 2018, but we made it up, at least for soybeans and corn and a couple of other commodities, with these market facilitation payments. How about 2019? Now the market facilitation payments come on big time. They squeeze the rest of it, but we also are having total payments that are almost double what they were a couple of years before. So we've really added to the farm bill payments with this ad hoc program that, again, is of the sort, sorry, we screwed up your market, here's a bunch of money to make it up to you. Come to 2020, and the green is now almost totally COVID payments, and it basically squeezes the others down, certainly in percentage terms, but now we're up to projections for 2020 of about $37 billion. Could it be 35? Could it be 40? Sure, but we're actually in pretty good shape to be on track to spend right around $37 billion, 23 billion of which, not quite 2/3 of which is, or a little more than 2/3 of which is these COVID payments. A few more words about the market facilitation program. That's our really, I would say, our first stab at, sorry, we screwed up your market, here's some money. Field crops, mostly grains and oilseeds, got 13.5 billion of that. So in 2019, they tried to spread it a little more widely. They said, gee, almonds and walnuts, they ought to get a little money, maybe pistachios, maybe a little bit for pecans and a few other things. Dairy and hogs will get a little, but when we say a little, we mean a very little. So here we're measuring it in 13.5 billion. Now we're saying 0.27 billion for about 40% of agriculture that would be called specialty crops. You take dairy and hogs together, you get, why they're together, that's just the way the data goes. Another $500 million or so. And there, Iowa, which is a pork state, hog state, California is a dairy state, Minnesota's both, Wisconsin is a little bit of both, and New York and others, they all get 0.2 billion or so, or 0.02 billion to get you to 57 billion total. A big chunk of change, or at least it seemed like it back in 2019. It's interesting to know where this goes politically, and where this money went in 2019 was really the Midwest. Events, you got your 7% up there. This is a share of total farm income. What share went to, came from these payments? Places with specialty crops like California, Oregon, Washington, and some of dairy states like Idaho were down to 1 or 2%. But throughout the Midwest and the South, we're at 7 or 8, up to 10% in soybean hotspots. What do we know about the COVID payments? Not a lot so far. It's hard to get data on which commodities it goes to. Vince is going to give you some income distribution numbers on this later, I think. What I will say is it's roughly in proportion to production or sales, is not quantity of production, but gross revenue across commodities. It's about 1% of the total CARES Act payments, somewhere like that. So in that sense, agriculture is about 0.6% of GDP. Maybe it gets its share. Is it enough? Was farming hurt worse than the rest of the economy or not? I don't think we have the data to be able to say that. What we do know, and to reinforce Barry's point, is that farm income will have gone up, not down this year. The COVID payments are passed out with a very broad brush. The USDA was, I'm not going to criticize any individual or any group at USDA. They were told, pass out a bunch of money really fast, and they did. And that's the best thing you can say about it. Nobody quite knows whether the criterion they used made any sense at all. Some final remarks. We're into a new era on farm subsidy payments. It's now compensation for government policy. It's not market failures. It's not, gee, these are public goods. It's, we screwed up your markets, we're going to pay you. These are not payments for poor people. No farm program payments ever are. They're payments for rich people. That is, anybody who owns businesses in America are wealthy people by national standards, and these payments went to those wealthy people. They are not payments that go to people because we have public good problems. It's hard to think of why you would transfer this much wealth away from future generations of taxpayers to buy higher farm income in 2019 and 2020. I do have a political economy model for that, but in economic terms, it's hard to think of a reason. I leave aside macroeconomic management because I don't see those rationales meeting what we did in agriculture, either for market facilitation or COVID payments. So what we're left with is a problematic path for the future. That is to say, how are we going to unravel this when the economy goes back to the next normal, the new normal, whatever it goes to? Do we have a rationale? Since we didn't have much rationale for making these payments to start with, do we have a rationale for unraveling it? And I think that really is the big question looking to the future.
Thanks.
See you later.
Thanks so much, Dan. And it's actually a really good segue to Diane, because you're talking about big payments, and now in a sense, she's talking about payments, but they're very, very little payments. So let me introduce our next panelists. So we hear from Diane Schanzenbach. She is the Margaret Walker Alexander Professor. I love all these names. Don't you love all these names? In the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern, where she is the director of the Institute for Policy Research. In her prior life, she served as director of the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution and as a researcher at the National Bureau of Economic Research, among other things. I should say, our panelists all have these incredible bios, and I've just, for the purposes of time, have really shortened them. So you can go to the website and find out more about them, or Google them and just see their incredible scholarship. So Diane, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. So I'm going to start by talking about food support policy during the recession that we're in, thanks to COVID. I know, we're framing this as in a post-COVID world, but we've got to start here. So just to start, I study SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, used to be known as food stamps, and it is one of the core safety net programs in the United States. Around 1 out of 8 people in the United States participates in SNAP, and it's worth about $160 per person per month that can be used to buy groceries at a normal grocery store. So what we know about SNAP during recessions is it's one of the most important programs that works countercyclically. So it, by design, expands so that more people, when they become needy because they've lost a job or other sources of support, can sign up for food stamps, for SNAP. So I'll show you a little bit more in a minute about what good work SNAP has been doing already during this pandemic. But to set the stage, I want to make the point that this recession is going to be with us for a long time. The unemployment rate is very high. As you know, it's spiked to almost 15 percentage points. It's come down to about 8%, but still Black unemployment and Hispanic and Latinx unemployment rates in the most recent month are still in double digits. The Congressional Budget Office predicts that we will have elevated rates of unemployment at least through 2022. It is certainly a challenge to monitor real-time economics. So, a lot of us are trying to understand what's happening with poverty, what's happening with food insecurity in the short run. I think it's fair to say at least 1 out of 5 adults report that they're food insecure. It's higher among families with children. Surprisingly, more than 1 out of 10 adults say that they don't have enough food to eat right now. The depth of this recession, especially for low-income workers, is just quite acute. Demand for charity food is off the charts, and quite sustained. If we know anything about recessions, it is that as the economy continues to get momentum, we're still going to see low-income families lag behind. It always takes longer for their incomes to recover. And so this all to say that SNAP is going to be extremely important, for the economy, for years to come. Now, I want to also note that the recovery, we can't even really get to that in earnest until we get rid of the virus. This virus, by all accounts, is holding back our recovery. And to be sure, we won't be on solid footing until the kids are back in school. So let me show just a couple of quick slides on the extent of SNAP during this pandemic. To Congress and the Department of Agriculture's great credit, they've immediately turned up the volume to 11 on SNAP as soon as the pandemic happened. So what this graph shows is spending in green and participation in orange in the months after basically when the recession started. The solid line is the COVID recession, and the dotted line is the Great Recession. Now let's sort of review the Great Recession, those dotted lines that goes all the way out to 12 months a little bit. If you recall, unemployment rose much more slowly during the Great Recession, and it peaked for only one single month at 10%. You can see there on this graph that SNAP spending, went up slowly, steadily in response to the increase in unemployment, and then got a boost when Congress passed, as part of the Recovery Act, a 15% increase in maximum benefits. So this time, The response of SNAP in terms of spending and in terms of participation has been much quicker and much stronger. So why did we see spending go up by so much? A couple of reasons. One is Congress granted states new flexibility that allowed them to concentrate on enrolling new families and be able to temporarily suspend recertifications. That was a really smart move to do in the middle of a pandemic. Kudos to all involved. The other thing that they did was increase benefits for all people who are on the caseload to the maximum benefit level. That's called the emergency allotment provision. And it was an increase of about $40 per week to that 60% of the SNAP participants who weren't already receiving the maximum benefit. Now, the flip side of that means that people who are already at the maximum benefit have not yet received any additional funds. Let's see. And so you can also see that participation has gone up. You know, the numbers are a little bit rocky, I would say, at this moment in time. And, you know, everyone's doing their best to try to extract the signal from the numbers away from the noise. Now, I'll also point out that the spending line here, which I've drawn from daily treasury statements, not something I knew existed prior to this pandemic, but I've learned a lot about them. It also includes this new program that Congress set up in the middle of a pandemic called the Pandemic Ebt Program, which provides essentially SNAP-like resources to families who lost access to free or reduced price lunches and meals during the pandemic. That has been an incredibly successful program. We did a study over the summer using the sort of varied timing in the rollout of that and found that in the weeks after a family received pandemic EBT payments, all sorts of measures of food hardship declined. So that was great news. Now, I appreciate that, you know, my agriculture economist colleagues on this have been sort of joking that I've got the elephant in the room. I've got, you know, sort of the large part of the Farm Bill that I'm going to discuss. But what I want to put into perspective a little bit is when I talk to other safety net scholars, they kind of laugh at me that it's a small little program. And so let me just point out how little of the total spending that we've made for relief payments has come out through that SNAP line, both through SNAP and the pandemic EBT payments. So this is through the end of July, weekly new spending that was done as part of the CARES Act. The green line here are those relief payments, the stimulus payments, and that makes up just under half of the total new money that was spent after the CARES Act. The orange, the unemployment insurance expansions, of course, it's gotten a lot of attention that there was a $600 weekly top up in benefits. I could also go into more detail about, they also expanded eligibility for some people who aren't usually eligible for unemployment insurance. And the teeny tiny blue part that you can barely see if you squint is that increase in USDA payments. So while it looks very large compared to prior recessions, you know, it is quite small relative to all the other payments that are being made. So that's the end of the slides, and I'll sort of turn back to just to my notes. As I think about what we need to do immediately, as we, you know, continue to fight the virus and, you know, try to provide relief in the recession, I think my number one would be to increase those maximum SNAP benefits. We saw on the slides that was used effectively during the Great Recession. Not only did it reduce hardship, but it also turned out to be one of the most effective ways to stimulate the economy, because money that's spent through SNAP, you know, when it goes to families, they spend that money quite promptly. They generally do it in their local economy, and that adds to multipliers. Mark Zandi did a calculation and determined that this had the biggest bang for the buck out of all of the stimulus and relief payments that were made during the Great Recession. It worked last time. I think we would expect it to work this time, especially when we're facing such elevated levels of unemployment and hardship. Now, of course, right now, the idea of having work requirements is, I would argue, absurd given the high rates of unemployment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that if we have time, but my preference is to use market incentives, other programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit and things like that, more carrots to make sure that families are combining SNAP benefits with also work. And of course, we've seen a big transition over the years so that many more families who are on SNAP are also working. I look forward to the time in the future when we get to argue again about, has the economy rebounded enough that we can start talking about work requirements again. I think that's going to be a long time, but let's all hope that it goes quickly so that we can just see the economy improve as quickly as possible. I would argue that at this moment in time, we can't do everything, of course, through food support. SNAP, can only be turned up so much. But I would argue that I think that it's a convenient way to target. And to date, relatively little of our spending has been targeted on low-income families. And I think that we've got plenty more room to go through just this SNAP line, through food support. And as we move into recovery, we need to make sure that we're making efficient use of SNAP ENT employment and training resources. We're going to need a lot of retraining. I think we don't know what industries are going to be destroyed in the wake of this. So now we can turn a little bit to thinking about the next Farm Bill. So generally, my argument is that the program is not broken, so do your best not to fix it. As many of you know, this follows very close to Milton Friedman's negative income tax. It's been with us for 50 years. It expands automatically, it declines automatically. We can argue about different parameters and, do we have the thrifty food plans appropriately, or, are we taxing away benefits, at the right rate? And I look forward to all of those debates, but I think fundamentally, this is a program that works well and, basically doesn't need fixing. A few more points about broader food policy that I think we'll need to address moving forward. The first is there are deep limitations to WIC, the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children that covers women prenatally, infants, and then up through age 5. The numbers so far have indicated that it has not expanded at all during COVID, even though we've had such great need. And I have been doing other writing that notes that there are deep flaws with the program, especially as it comes to children. There's more and more evidence about how important adequate nutrition is during early life. And so we need to either fix this program or think about some other ways. I know my time is running short, so 2 other areas to think about. The next is that we are going to need new national momentum to address childhood obesity. We had been making slow, steady progress against that. And I think the predictions are that COVID is going to have set us back at least a decade on that. I hope that I'm wrong on that. I don't suggest we do that through the Farm Bill, but I do think that that's something that people interested in food policy are going to need to be thinking about. And then just a few sort of final ones that are technocratic in nature. You invite a bunch of economists, you got to talk a little bit of technocracy. Something that was odd was the decision in the last administration to relocate the Economic Research Service to my home state of Missouri. It was framed as draining the swamp, and I don't usually think of my fellow agricultural economists as swamp creatures, although it is Halloween, so maybe. They do such important work undergirding a wide range of USDA programs. And it's really important that we rebuild that infrastructure because they suffered just a large brain drain with the big move. We know that error rates in SNAP need additional attention, mostly the monitoring of that. The fidelity of this program is extremely important. And then finally, and then I will turn it over, I do think it's time to think about updating the underlying notion of the thrifty food plan, which I think is increasingly out of date, and we should update it to something that's more evidence-based, more empirically based. Looking forward to the questions. Great.
Thank you, Diane. I remember my days at Tufts University. I was in the School of Nutrition Science and Policy. Endless hours on the thrifty food plan. Good stuff. So we could talk about it. We can talk. All right. So our final panelist almost needs no introduction to this crowd, of course, is Vince Smith. Now, I've asked Vince to come speak at my events, and you know how these things boomerang. So he reached out to me to be moderator, and I'm actually very grateful because so far this has been a fascinating panel. I've learned some things. Let me introduce you to Vince in case you do not know this man. He is a professor of economics in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics at Montana State. And he's co-director of MSU's Agricultural Marketing Policy Center. Currently, he's a visiting AEI scholar and director of AEI's Agricultural Policy Initiative. Vince, the Zoom stage is yours. Oh, you're muted, Vince.
I'm no longer muted. Thank you so much, Kathleen. I'm going to pull up my slides. We all have slides, and they're not interesting ones like the ones at children's playgrounds, but I'm going to pull up my slides and then we'll start. Oh, there we go. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's my pleasure to be talking about what the US does to address poverty and hunger in a more global context rather than in the US context. Those programs also fall heavily within the Farm Bill rubric, although many of the policies are implemented through the USAID, the Agency for International Development. Before I go there, though, my colleague Garrett Glasgow and I have some recent research looking at what types of farms, large commercial farms or small and medium-sized, quote, family farms, have received the recent trade war called market facilitation payments and the CARES Act related COVID-19 compensation payments. Over the past 3 years, obviously the CARES Act money has come this year. What I'm going to show you is what's called a Lorenz curve, and sorry for the language. If from small scale farms to large scale farms, everyone, the small guys, the 10% of farms that are small got the same amount of total spend on a program as the largest 10%, we would have a straight line running from the 0% in the bottom left-hand corner up to the top right-hand corner. That's not what we have. These payments through the trade compensation program, which I think was largely imaginary myself in terms of compensating for losses, are heavily weighted towards the largest farms. And the program that was initiated under the CARES Act, implemented by USDA, looks very similar in terms of who gets what. The monies are going to large farm operations, not small scale family farms or even mid-sized family farms. And just to give you a sense, the average farm that was about at the 50th percent of farms organized by low sales to high sales got about $3,000 in CFAP program payments. another 3,000 under the first market facilitation payments, a lot more under the second, 1,600 under the trade war first round payment, a lot more under the second round because there was a lot more money in the program. In terms of the share of all payments, over 64% of all payments in the CARES Act program have gone to the largest 10% of farms. And that was true for the trade war payments, the market facilitation payments in 2018, a little bit less concentrated for a complex number of reasons for the 2019 outlays. Well, all those shared numbers don't necessarily speak very directly to, all right, how much money are people getting? But just take a look at the top 20% of farmers. If you on average are one of the top 20% of farmers in terms of farm sales and size of payments, you got about $35,000 from the CARES Act payment. And these are largely going, by the way, to individuals, not to big corporations. You got 36,000 out of the 2018 trade war payments and about 7,000 out of the 19 payments. Now contrast that with the what we're doing domestically for poor people whose incomes are almost uniformly less than these numbers. And if you look at the top 1%, the largest 1% of farms, they're getting $250,000 per farm for the CFAP payments if they are large, over nearly $150,000 under the 2018 program, and nearly $300,000 under the 2019 trade war program. So as Dan very markedly and correctly pointed out, these are not payments going to farms run by people with income problems or net worth problems. They're going to the rich. And that's the nature of the farm program beast. So compare that with what Diane showed you, where there was a minuscule, really, increase in total spend out of all of the support budget from the CARES Act for people who are in need of food stamp help. Now, I want to turn very quickly, and because I only have a few minutes, to what are we doing through the Farm Bill in international programs. Emergency food aid programs are going to be first up, and international agricultural development programs are going to be second up. Currently, a common theme for these two programs is that funds from both of them substantially benefit US located and other interest groups who are not, in the public's minds, the intended beneficiaries, though maybe in Congress's mind. So let's talk about emergency food aid programs. These are programs where from the US, we ship food to desperately poor people who are in dire straits because of man-made or natural catastrophes, drought, war, flood, you name it. We do things differently with respect to food aid. We require, in contrast to almost all other rich countries who do a lot of this too, that almost all food for aid be sourced in the United States, rather than more locally or regionally, where it can more efficiently and quickly be sent to the people in need, the people that most of us want to help. We also make the rule that half of the aid must be carried on US flagged ships, rather than internationally. And research that with colleagues I've been engaged with, and Chris Barrett at Cornell has been engaged with for many years, really come down on that approach because those costs are much higher. The benefits that are claimed for the cargo preference mandate by the US shipping industry are largely about defense. There'll be more merchant marine sailors and ships available to the US military, and there's some incentive to encourage US shipbuilding. What's the evidence on those claims? Work by Stephanie Mercier and myself and by Chris Barrett and others come down on as follows. Almost all cargo preference ships used since 2013, and this is absolutely true, by the way, that are owned by US shippers were actually built in other countries. In fact, more China-built ships are used to ship cargo preference goods at higher cost because they're owned by US shippers than ships built in the United States, at least over the last 6 or 7 years. And over 40% of all cargo preference shipments are carried by US flagged ships are owned by a subsidiary of Maersk, the Danish international conglomerate. So really we're supporting as much as domestic companies, foreign companies through the mandate. And the mandate, what does it do to the number of sailors who have jobs that are US sailors? But well, no more than about 480 sailors, none of whom, by the way, under any of these programs are required to serve on ships when the US military needs them. So effectively, the benefits are virtually, in fact, existentially non-existent. What about the impact on food aid budgets? By itself, the cargo preference mandate increases annual food and shipping costs by about $50 billion and allows US shipping companies to have shipping rates that are 50% higher than if these goods were shipped through competitive bidding where everybody who has ships could compete. But when you couple that program to the mandate to source food from the US as opposed to locally and regionally, the mandates increase costs by about $350 million out of a total food aid budget of about $1.4 billion, around 30% of that budget. If we were to end the two mandates, what does that mean about humanitarian aid? It actually means that USAID can credibly consider using those resources to help as many as 8 million more people around the world. From a humanitarian perspective, that's a really important issue. And also from a soft power perspective, creating goodwill for the United States around the world, we know that food aid does exactly that. So the costs are actually substantial in terms of US national defense from these, frankly, antiquated programs that were first introduced in 1954. What about USAID programs for agricultural development? What are we doing to encourage more productivity globally in very poor countries when it comes to agriculture? Well, we give USAID, the primary development agency, about $20 billion in annual appropriations, and it's very broadly spent. I have all of the numbers for roughly how it's distributed. About 40% goes to Africa, where there are many agricultural projects. And agricultural projects themselves account for around 15% of the total spending. And the USAID maintains 60 country missions in very poor countries and uses a plethora of partners in delivering agricultural development programs. However, many of those partners are for-profit contractors. Now, there's some real issues with how we put into effect these international programs. We do use a plethora of partners, many of which are for-profit contractors. And effectively, we use a lot of US universities who themselves can be largely viewed as for-profit contractors if we're being a little cruel about it. And we use other local in-country partners, but often based in urban areas, not in the countryside, to deliver specific programs and projects. The contractors, many of which are beltway bandits, some of which are not, and the universities, think about the Lancs and many of the land-grant universities, charge substantial overhead rates, up to 50% in the case of universities, and often 100% on top of the expected costs in the case of private contractors. They use relatively high-priced non-local employees. Well, frankly, people like Dan and myself and Barry, who are very costly in the global context. They allocate a substantial share of their budgets for services also from in-country urban areas, often the capital city, where costs are high. The USAID itself also charges an overhead rate on these funds of about 9%. The bottom line is that people like Chris Barrett and others have estimated that less than 5% of the total funds, the total $6 billion, actually flow to the farmers and villages to implement on-the-ground development projects out of that total budget. What is clearly needed there is some reform of administration. There's also an issue about program targeting. For very understandable poverty alleviation reasons, much of USAID's efforts and the efforts of many other countries' development programs have focused on very small farms that are very poor. And from a poverty alleviation perspective, that's a good thing. But somewhat larger farms are the farms that are more likely to increase productivity. And we're not talking about going from very small 1 and 2 hectare, what are called often smallholder farms, to big estate farms in, say, Tanzania or Zambia. What we're talking about are 5 to 10 to 15 acre farms, also out in the countryside. The problem there is that the smallholder focused, very small smallholder focus has not improved agricultural productivity in the country, and therefore has contributed not very much at all to overall economic growth. We're talking about 70, 50, 60% of the population here. And it's not improved access to food in both rural and urban areas. So food security for the country as a whole has not moved forward very effectively at all. So what do we need to do to solve these overall problems? Well, one recommendation would be to ask whichever administration arrives on January the 20th or thereabouts of next year, just reduce spending on private contracts, go alternative ways, more closely manage university overhead, give them a 10 or 15% overhead, move away from expensive out-of-country consultants and so on. Use the money saved by that, not to move away from helping very poor farmers, but to retarget agricultural growth in low-income countries. So with that, I'm going to quit and return to the moderator. Thank you.
Thanks, Vince. All right, so now it's Q&A time. I have a few, and there are also some that have been lining up in the chat box. I'm actually going to start with you, Vince. Last but not least kind of thing. But anyhow, here's my question for you, because I've seen your presentations before, and there's a theme there about how the big guys are winning, right, in the payment war. And my question to you is, like, who doesn't know this? I'm not criticizing the scholarship. I'm just trying to figure out how things changed. In the last Farm Bill, we reversed on payment limitations. So what is it that's going to change to what about those charts that you shared is going to change things? How do we communicate that? Who needs to come to the table?
Well, I think the intelligent, look, I was about to say something that was not politically correct. Informing the public about the underlying issues, the underlying reasons why we have the farm programs that we have, and whether or not they save the family farm, and at what efficiency costs they impose, is really important. Barry talked a lot about crop insurance. We know that crop insurance is not an appropriate program in terms of preserving fragile soils. It's not an appropriate program in terms of encouraging the use of land that maintains agricultural productivity while mitigating climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, sorry. We know other programs are simply redistribution of income programs from the poor to the rich. We have, regrettably, some journalists in major journals writing on agricultural policy who don't get that, or if they know it, they don't deal with it. So educating the public, educating the people who are asked, often at the drop of a hat, to write about agricultural policy in the media, sharing that information is extremely important. But it's also important to share that information with local legislators, congressional legislators. The information about agricultural policy should be highlighted in a more effective way. You and I, Kathleen, know these facts. Dan has known these facts for way longer than he's had his current gorgeous beard. But many, many people in the public still have this image of farming as 1930s grapes of wrath operations. And that's just not the case in
Thank you.
95% of the cases. And the
Great.
5% that like that don't get the money.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm going to try to do a quick round robin here of questions. That's great. Thanks for that thought, Vince. So Diane, I'm going to go back and look at that WIC program because that's fascinating that we haven't seen an uptake during COVID in these tough times. So that's a whole kettle of fish. But I do want to ask you about a question that Tom Vilsack and I faced when we were in office together, and that was we had the request from the state of New York, from Mayor Bloomberg, to have restrictions on how SNAP could be spent, particularly around sugar drinks. And so when you're looking in your crystal ball, and it's such a proponent for these very important, to me, those nutrition programs, that's the safety net in the Farm Bill of the greatest magnitude. When you're looking at that kind of safety net and thinking about the increasing public pressure to have some restrictions on SNAP, how does that hit you? What are you thinking?
Oh, well, first, one more plug on WIC. There are more 3-year-olds in the United States on SNAP than there are on WIC, even though WIC is designed for people that age, and it has a much higher income cutoff. And so that, just to sort of underscore the relative importance of these. Yeah, without question, I think we'll be debating more potentially restrictions or incentives on SNAP in the next Farm Bill. In the last Farm Bill, I testified before the House about this. Speaking as an economist and someone who's studied SNAP, most SNAP benefits are quite modest, and that means that people have to combine their own cash with SNAP benefits in order to buy all of their groceries. I think there's good evidence that as a result, if we said you can't purchase sugar sweetened beverages with SNAP benefits, it will not change consumption of that. And in fact, if we wanted to promote healthy consumption, I think we've got very good evidence that subsidizing healthy foods is with the price incentive, giving some money back if you buy, fruits and vegetables or sort of whatever the targeted goods are. We've got randomized controlled trial from the Healthy Incentive Pilot in Massachusetts from a couple of years ago that shows that works. That's my preferred approach because it works with the market through price incentives.
Great. For those of you who may not know, so that petition came before USDA in 2010-ish maybe, and we denied it. And I've always wondered if that might have, since there's that sort of conversation snowballing, had we said yes to New York, they could have been a pilot and we would have gotten a lot of good data that could inform, we mentioned Massachusetts. So anyhow, bygones. Let me go to you, Barry. So I see that you teach a class, or you have for many years, for seniors on agricultural policy. So when your students are finishing up their semester, what's the most important lesson you hope they've learned?
Oh boy, that's a great question. Right now we're in this weird world of online teaching and everything. So I sit in this chair twice a week and give the class. But I would say, I try to get them first to understand sort of what the motivations are for payments and subsidies. And it's not necessarily, as Vince said, saving the family farm and so forth. I want them to think about it, in terms of an economic perspective. And then I think that anybody who's going into agribusiness, I think what separates agricultural economics from economics really is the Farm Bill, and they need to understand the mechanics of that and how it operates. So those are the two things that I think. And it's every farmer needs to know about crop insurance. We may not think that it's necessarily a socially beneficial program. I don't think there's any market failure there, But if we're training our students to go out into agribusiness, they need to understand what the options are, I think. So it's really a conflict of things.
By the way, the new census of organic agriculture was released last Thursday, and they asked farmers about farm programs. And one of the things I noted that there was well over 1,000 organic farmers who didn't know crop insurance was available to them. And there was something like 150 crop insurance agents that didn't know that there was an option. So there's work to be done in all different ways. All right, so
RMA has made crop type practice types across the board for organic commodities now, and there's a little difference in the risk profile, and there's some controversy about that in terms of the premium rates, but almost any crop now has organic option.
So Dan, I'll turn to you. When my students are being lazy, I assign them a paper on the history of milk marketing orders and tell them I'm going to test them on it. They wake up pretty fast and they get in line because nobody wants to read that paper. But anyhow, my question to you is: you gave us a pretty grim view of what's going on in dairy in terms of government support and where things are going. If you had a magic wand, and you're there in California where there's a lot of dairy, what would we be doing? How would we be changing the slices in that pie chart of where money's going?
Yeah, I could talk about dairy for a minute. I'll tell you, I talk about dairy policy in my course. My undergraduate course is the Economics of Agricultural Sustainability. Half of it's about the food system, half of it's about farming. And when I talk about dairy, I say we have this thing, the milk marketing orders justified by orderly marketing, and 2020 is a great example. It's like driving down Highway 1 where you only look in the rear view mirror. You go off the cliff, and that's what's happened this year. We literally mandate minimum prices for milk products by watching the prices 2 months in the past. Nothing has made milk marketing more disorderly than milk marketing orders. So the first thing I do is just eliminate those. There's just no conceivable rationale. The COVID payments, I'm just neutral about. You know, we have this massive disaster that hit the whole economy. We shut down big chunks of the economy and made the decision, if we're going to do that, people ought to be compensated, whether it's with food stamp money or unemployment payments or other things, and passing out lots and lots of taxpayer money made sense. So I don't have a big criticism there, one way or the other. We could quibble with it. It was hard to get straight. Unraveling that is a real challenge, and particularly in agriculture. You know, we had a temporary program back in 1933, and we still got it and it was never to help poor people. You didn't pour out milk and kill pigs when people were hungry to help poor people. It was always just always ill-defined and poorly operated. And Vince and I go back and forth. I say it was never about poor people, and it couldn't be about poor people. So let's just admit it's for rich people and let it go at that, and criticize it for what's wrong with it, even as a rich person's subsidy. In terms of dairy, it's very hard to figure out what you'd want to do. Certainly the crop insurance for dairy program that we've got makes about as much sense as the ones Vince was criticizing. It's just hard to think of a reason you'd have such things other than the former Secretary of Agriculture works for the dairy industry now.
All right, well, back to me. So I have a question that came in through our audience, and I think it's a really timely and important question. I want everyone on the panel to address this, and we don't have much time, so quickly, but we've had this year of not just the pandemic, but also a reckoning with our history on race, and a call out on the lack of social justice and food systems. And I see this in every forum that I'm in, and I don't want us to close out without addressing it. We're all white panelists. I've always contended that if we really want to change ag policy, we also have to change the people around the decision-making table to better reflect the demographics of this country. So what are we going to do in our own work going forward to change the situation? And I will start with Barry.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that's on all of our minds right now. You know, we need more diversity within our profession. There's no doubt about it. We've tried to do that. I served a brief stint as a department chair, and that was one of the main things that comes up. And I don't have the answers really. I just do know that it's something that's very important for us. We need a diverse body of students, and I think we've done a good job trying to get to that, but much less so on, you know, in terms of the faculty side and then the professionals who are out there working. So, you know, it would be very nice to see a non all white panel like we have here. So, but I don't know the answers. Maybe Vince has some ideas there.
Sorry.
Oh, over to you, Vince.
I think that we have to aggressively address these issues of race with the young. We have to increase the resources that are provided to young people, particularly people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And that means many Hispanic and African American families to access education, starting from kindergarten and pre-kindergarten, all the way through universities. Where I sit in Montana, the minority population are American Indian communities. And there's a great deal that still needs to be done to enable young people from those communities to have access to high quality kindergarten and elementary, middle school, high school, and university education in settings that are very difficult. I did some work on alcohol and drug abuse, and on the 6 of the 7 reservations in Montana, among low-income families, those are serious problems, but they feed back into the opportunities available to the young people. If we don't help the young, if we don't make, in many contexts, heroic efforts to create possibilities for those people, for those young people, we are not going to move those people into the opportunities that we fundamentally all believe everyone deserves.
Great. Diane.
Yeah, I'm going to tell a pipeline story too, which is, of course, we need to be, actively working on this issue. And it shouldn't be that hard because we're talking about food and everybody can relate to food. And I find in my undergraduate courses, when I talk about SNAP and I talk about its role in, making sure that families have enough to eat and its a role in the broader safety net, students from a wide variety of backgrounds are engaged with that. And so I think, we need a little bit of a makeover, sort of lead with some of our most exciting work, but fundamentally food is fascinating. And we need to get that word out and develop the pipeline.
Thanks. Dan, you got the last word on this question.
Yeah, I'll also take a local approach to this. We're all university people here, and at the universities in California, Kathleen, it's very much like Arizona State. The Hispanic population is large, and it's much of it is agriculturally based. And there's a population that we're working very actively to try to develop at UC Davis, not just through the undergraduate program, but on through the graduate programs. Because we know, and this goes to the leadership, and you led with saying, what can we do to use some of this to change agriculture and food policy? And there, I think we're not just training, people for a job somewhere. That's great, that's good, but we're also training leaders who will help make the decisions and improve the decision making. And I was really glad that you led with that, because I think we do have a generation coming who can really take over And it'll be, at least in the students that I'm working with, a much more diverse population of people. That's what we're working on. Vince highlighted, you know, you sit at the university and say, gee, I wish the kindergartens would do a better job, and then we'd have better students to work with. And all of that's important, but we can do our job, whether it's remedial things or whatever, to bring people up to speed quickly. And I agree with Diane, food and agriculture is such a exciting topic to work on and to think about, that it really can be attractive to students. And you put that together with resiliency and sustainability and those questions, and we can be really attractive and get some of the best and brightest working with us.
Great, thank you. Well, everybody, we're out of time. I really appreciate you joining AEI for this informative panel. I'm very sorry to those of you whose questions weren't asked, including my friend Mary Ahern. Hi there. But hopefully you'll have an opportunity to reach out to these great panelists. We just set the stage for so many interesting conversations going forward. So be well, everybody. Mask up, be safe. See you on the other side.